Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Jessie Jarvis about her experience as a rancher with virtual fencing. Jessie talks about how their family made this decision, what the onboarding process looks like, what some of the benefits are, as well as what other ranchers need to consider before making this investment, because it can be a big one. Before we dive into that conversation, I want to remind you that I am booking 2025 speaking gigs, so whether you are looking for a workshop leader, panelist, moderator, or keynote, head to my website to connect with me. But with that, let's visit with Jessie.
Want to boost your ranch profitability? Choose Red Angus. Celebrated as the beef industry's most favored female, Red Angus cattle are a consistent source of traditional Angus traits, including carcass quality, maternal characteristics, calving ease, and moderate size. Over the past decade, Red Angus registrations have surged by 24%. Elevate your herd with Red Angus by heading to redangus.org to connect with the Red Angus team.
Well, Jessie, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast yet again, another person who's been on the list for quite a while. So I am excited to have you on the show. There are a lot of things that you and I could talk about and share with the listeners, but today we're going to be talking about virtual fencing. So to help the listeners understand a little bit more about you, can you share why you choose to work in the beef industry every day?
Oh, I love that you're starting with a hard-hitting question. And you're right, we could talk for hours, probably about just about anything too. But why I choose to work in the beef industry every day is there is no better way to, one, work, but two, to raise a family. And so I am just so thankful for the opportunity that I had growing up on our ranching operation and to get to be around my grandma and my parents as much as I was able to in that, and then also now being able to work alongside my parents and to work with my spouse and to raise our own children in that same way of life, and to get to take my kids to do the things that I did when I was their age, whether it's moving cows in the same place or fixing a stretch of fence that, oh, I remember when we put this in when I was a kid, or like watering trees that we planted when I was a couple years old, like those types of things, just knowing that we have been here for as long as we have and have stewarded the land as we have, like that really just means so much.
Yeah, the legacy really means a lot to a lot of people. So can you also share with the listeners a little bit more about kind of the size and scope of your operation? I mean, you already shared that it's a family operation, but just so listeners kind of have a little bit of an idea of kind of where you're at and what you're doing before we dive into the virtual fencing side of things.
Yeah, of course. So we ranch in southern Idaho. We're about halfway between Boise and Twin Falls. And we are kind of where the Great Basin Desert meets the Sawtooth Mountains. So everything south of us to the Nevada border, and then obviously on into Nevada, is desert. And then everything north of us from the Snake River that's the start of the Sawtooth Mountains. And so everything from here basically to Canada in Idaho is mountains. We live right alongside the Snake River, which is great for us because that's how we're able to irrigate all of our crops. We unfortunately live in an area where we get about 11 to 13 inches of rain a year. So in order to grow anything, we have to irrigate. We are chained to our pivots and our hand lines in the summer, which I'm very envious of those who live in the Midwest or in the Palouse or areas where they can dryland farm, because that irrigation, it's a wonderful thing to have, obviously, but Mother Nature isn't helping us out when it comes to moisture. So we run a commercial cattle operation. My parents, they focus on Black Angus. And then my husband and I, Justin, we have our own herd and we focus a little bit more on the Red Angus side of things. So, and when my grandparents first started, so my dad's parents, they started with 13 Hereford cows. And obviously that was back in the 40s. Herefords were totally the thing. And things have kind of changed in that way, at least here in our area. And so our herd has transitioned from being a predominantly Hereford herd to then slowly bringing on more of the Black Angus side of things when it came to genetics. And then in my lifetime, we have now switched over to only Angus genetics. And then when Justin and I got married, that was the thing, because he was a Hereford guy and I was an Angus girl. And so I remember thinking to myself, how are we ever going to get married? Because I'm not going to put a Hereford bull on my cows and he's not going to put an Angus bull on his cows. And so we compromised. We chose Red Angus, and that was probably one of the best compromises that we've ever made because we have never been happier with just all of the genetic components that that breed brings. But that's kind of, our herds. And then as far as how we run our cattle, we live obviously in the state of Idaho, where 60% of the state is public lands. So we do have deeded acres that we run cattle on, but predominantly our herd runs on public lands, which is obviously kind of important as we get into this conversation about virtual fence and why we chose that and how it's working for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, you know me, I always love a good Red Angus story. So
That's one of the many things we could talk about.
yeah. Well, so since you kind of led into it already, do you want to talk a little bit about why did you decide to go down the virtual fencing route? Was it something you had been seeing and wanted to try? Was there kind of a grazing situation that almost in a sense forced you to try it? Like, why virtual fencing?
Yeah, this is a great question. So to be very forward and upfront, no, this is not necessarily something that we wanted to do just for the desire of wanting to try something new. So we live in an area that is very fire prone. And we have, in my lifetime, experienced large burns before. And usually what happens when it comes to the BLM lands that we graze is when a fire comes through, if it's large enough, the BLM will choose to seed that back. And then if they are going to seed that area, then you have to stay off of that permit for a minimum of 2 years. So in the past, that's really forced our hand as far as not being able to graze those areas for 2 years and even longer in some situations, because we've had areas that it's burned, they've seeded back, we have not grazed it for a year. In that fall, let's say it's caught on fire, it's been large enough to where they've needed to seed that back. And so you can potentially go years and years and years without being able to use what is your permitted grazing area just due to large fires. So earlier this summer, at the end of July, we had a fire that burned about half of one of our allotments. And this specific allotment was one that we've used in the winter. So it's a winter allotment. We will also bring cattle back after we brand them. When we turn out on the 1st of April, we will keep our cattle in there, usually for the month of April. And then a couple weeks into May, we'll put our bulls into this field with those cows so that they can get bred up. And then we take them into a larger field. But the bulk of this allotment is grazed specifically in the winter. And so it was pretty unfortunate for us because it borders lands that we own. So it's really easy for us to just open the gate from what we own and send those cattle out to those pastures, or even when we have to bring them in, because we have to be off of those permits the month of March when we're taking those pairs because they've got fresh babes on them. But anyways, so we had this fire and we thought, this is unfortunate, but we can kind of move some other things around and we'll be able to find another place for these cows to graze over the winter. Well, 10 days later, we had another fire, and that unfortunately burnt half of the other allotment where we winter our cows. So we went from having no issues to worry about in a matter of 10 days to then having to wonder, okay, well, this was our plan B, basically, of where we were going to run these cows. So now, where are we going to put them? And one of the things that is very unique about the management plan, and I don't necessarily know if this is specific to our BLM office or if this is all Bureau of Land Management field offices, but when a fire is still burning, it will have a containment date that we expect the fire to be contained at such and such time on such and such date. And once they make that containment designation, the field office has 2 weeks from that moment to put together their recap plan. So are we going to seed this? What are we going to seed it back with? Are cattle going to be able to graze this? Are they not? How are we going to, basically it's the management plan post fire. So from that second fire, we had 2 weeks to basically decide how we were going to run the majority of our herd for those winter months. And this was at a time, this would have been the 1st of August or the first week of August. So in theory, we only have a couple of months now to make the decision of where we're going to winter these cows, because we start weaning in October and November. So we were able to work with our BLM office, our field office here that we run out of, and they had a neighboring field office that had used virtual fencing for some permittees. It was a specific project that they had used it for. It was never used post-fire recovery, which is how we're using this. But our field office, RangeCon, came to us and said, hey, we have this technology available. If it's something you guys would be interested in, we are willing to speak with this other field office to see, how it worked and if it's something that we can use those base stations for to kind of help you guys out, because we know that you are in this really difficult predicament of having to make these difficult management decisions, because if we weren't able to use both of those fields, we probably would have been faced with the decision of having to sell a good portion of our herd, which I also think that there's some silver linings that can come from that, right? You're going to really cull very heavily and you're going to only keep the best genetics. And so in every situation, there's good that can come from it. But when you pour your heart and your soul into the genetics of your herd, it's not necessarily the decision that you want to have to make.
No, not at all. So then, if you don't mind me asking, and if you don't want to answer this, that's okay. Did they help cover some of the costs for that virtual fence for you, since they kind of brought it forward as an option? Or was that something they said, yeah, we can help you, but you still have to cover all the costs for it?
Yeah, so how it worked was they were able to provide a base station for us. So we didn't have to go and buy the base station because they had one in that other field office that wasn't being used. So they said, you guys can use this, but we had to purchase the collars. And how it works, so we're using Vents is the brand of virtual fencing that we're using. And how that works is it's basically an annual subscription. So it's like Netflix or Amazon Prime.
Mm-hmm.
You pay for each collar for a year. So for us, it was $40 for the collar, and then it's $10 per battery. Each collar only needs one battery, but a battery will last about 6 to 9 months. So if you are going to use virtual fencing for a year, your chances are you're going to need 2 batteries. But we are only using it for about 4 to 5 months out of the year, and then we'll switch those. The batteries don't need to be like in a full charge over the summer, and then in the fall, we'll switch those batteries out, put in a fresh one, and then use them again over the winter.
Okay. So since that office already had that base station, did you really have an option to kind of shop around for which virtual fence company you wanted to go with? Or did you kind of have to say Vents is the option?
So we didn't have an opportunity to shop around, but we also didn't necessarily look for an opportunity to shop around because we were so new to virtual fencing and kind of thrown into like, okay, well, what are our other options? And we don't have one, and you guys already have the base station, and we know that that's the biggest investment. So it just made the most sense for us to use that.
Okay. So because of that unique situation where you were kind of thrown into it as almost your only option, or selling your cows, what was kind of the onboarding process like? Did you feel like it was pretty simple to grasp and start? Were there kind of some hiccups? Kind of talk about that.
Yeah, so this is probably going to be a little bit more unique to us versus anybody else. Because I'm thinking if somebody is going to use virtual fencing, because maybe they want to rotationally graze, or they too have experienced a fire and it's in an allotment that they're actively grazing and they want to be able to go put their cows back on that allotment, you can kind of do that at any time, right? But for us, because it was a field that we were going into with dry cows after we had weaned and pregged, we were basically onboarding with Vents in the middle of doing all of our other fall work. So we are gathering, weaning, sorting things, preg testing, processing calves, learning this brand new technology that we know absolutely nothing about. And then also too, because we didn't collar all of our animals, we only chose to do 150 head just because we didn't want to put all of our eggs in one basket, especially for the first year, not necessarily knowing how it was going to work. So we then had to strategically sort out those cows that we wanted to collar, put them somewhere else, get all of our other work done, send those back to the fields that they would winter in. So it definitely required a lot of strategic planning that we weren't necessarily used to. I mean, we're strategic planners, don't get me wrong there, but just in a different method that we were not necessarily planning on doing. But that being said, so the onboarding process itself, working with vents, was absolutely amazing. We have had the best customer service with them. When you purchase your collar subscription, you're also given basically, I think they're called a customer success representative, but I have somebody, one contact who I work with if I have any questions. So if I have a problem, I call her or I email her or I text her and she is available to me. So it's not like with Netflix where you buy the subscription and then you're forced to figure it out on your own. They walk you through all of the onboarding. They help me set fences the first time and do any kind of collar programming that I needed to. And if I had any questions throughout the process, obviously I have access to them. So that makes it really, really nice. And again, because we haven't ever used any other type of technology, I don't know, maybe that is standard for all other virtual fence options, but that has been really, really wonderful. But I will say it was definitely stressful to be learning how to use virtual fencing, knowing that your cattle could get an electronic stimulus in a time where we are already so busy with work. If we were learning this in May or June, and that was the only thing that we had to focus on, that probably would have been much easier than like, hey, we're doing all this other stuff. Why not throw another thing on the fire?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there supposed to be like a training period for the cows too? Like it's not like you just slap the collars on and all of a sudden you're good to go, right? You have to kind of train them to that stimulus.
Yes. And so the training lasts 4 days. And basically how it works on the first day, you make your hard fences hot, for lack of a better word. So that's where a cow, if she's going to get within 5 meters of the hard fence, she would receive that electronic stimulus. And then the next day, you bring it in 10 meters. So instead of 5 meters, it's 10 meters. The third day, you introduce sound. So it is just like a dog virtual fence collar where the dog is going to get the sound before they get the stimulus. And then on the fourth day, you basically try to cut the field in half. So you really want those cattle to understand there is a true invisible border here. And I will say, I had my reservations that I was going to be able to train a cow. I am kind of young, but I'm not young enough to be naive to the fact that cattle never do what you want them to, right? No matter how well you handle them, right? Things can always kind of go awry. But I was absolutely blown away by how quickly our cattle took to that training period. But that being said, that was also just another issue for us is, okay, where are we going to train these animals? What size of field do we have here at our house where it's going to be easy to watch them and also be able to cut it in half without impacting their water or feed or make it too small of an area, where it wouldn't be safe for them to be trained in. And then again, it was in the fall. So are we going to have to feed them? Because no cowman ever wants to have to feed their cow hay if they don't have to. So a lot of different considerations that we definitely had to go through in that training process.
Support your cattle's health and productivity with Vigortone minerals. Since 1912, Vigortone has been a trusted name in animal nutrition. The revitalized product line offers targeted nutrition for every stage of production and every region. Vigortone delivers consistent performance and simplifies your mineral decisions. Wherever you are, Vigortone works. Visit vigortone.com to learn more, and that link is also in the show notes. Were there any other reservations you kind of had before starting this?
I don't want to say learning something new, but honestly, that's what it is. We're not opposed to trying new things by any means, but we are absolutely a well-oiled machine. Like, we don't try new things just to try new things, if you will. If it's not broke, don't fix it. But if there is an opportunity to become more effective or efficient, then we are absolutely going to try to make ourselves better. But again, this isn't necessarily something that we just decided to do because, like, oh, virtual fence sounds cool. We want to bring that into our operation. So we were kind of forced in a way to make the decision. But I'm so glad that we did, especially because in the past, when we've had those big burns in my lifetime, we've had the opportunity to fence those allotments off. And somebody may ask the question of like, well, why didn't you just fence it versus using virtual fencing? So we have a couple of different reasons why we weren't able to. The first reason is in these fields, or in one of these fields specifically, a county road runs right through the middle of it. So in addition to putting in a fence, we would have also had to put in a cattle guard on the county road, which is the county is not responsible for. We would have had to make that investment and then put it in there for a couple of years. That doesn't necessarily make the most sense. We also have natural gas pipelines and the Oregon Trail that run through both of these allotments. And so when it comes to just general access to those natural gas pipelines, fencing it is not necessarily ideal. And then the BLM didn't want us to fence over the Oregon Trail, even if it was just a temporary hot wire fence, because they do take those like geological and historical areas very seriously. So for us, the option was either use virtual fencing or don't run your cows here for 2 years.
Do you think it's something that you would want to continue in the future now that you've done it for a few months?
I've gotten this question from a lot of producers because, especially in our area, as I mentioned, fire being so very common, we have had a lot of producers reach out to us and say, hey, how is this going for you guys? Is this something that you would continue doing after the fact? And I can absolutely see the merits of doing so. Where we run our cattle, we have some really big allotments, which is great, but then also not great. Sometimes we wish that we did have a fence that cut them in half so that it would be easier to get things bred up in the spring, or when we're gathering in the fall, we could kind of bring them closer to the house versus having to go all the way out to the back of the allotment to get things, right? We could be a little bit more strategic in how we moved those cows and then also how we utilized our resources. So I absolutely see it as being advantageous when it came to breeding season, to really being able to keep those cattle in an area to where they could get bred up much quicker in a much tighter calving window, I should say. And even in ways of just general resource management, right? So we have larkspur in a couple of our fields in the spring, and we know those specific areas, but it would be great to make an exclusion. So basically, you can't go in this island where there's going to be larkspur, which you could potentially die from, to then obviously we wouldn't lose cattle that way. So I absolutely seeing it as being an advantage. But I will say in the area that we run our cattle, we would need a number of base stations in order to do that. And with those base stations, I think that they are, I believe, $10,000 to $12,000. They obviously pay for themselves over time. And it, unlike the collar, is once you buy it, you own that asset. So you can sublease it out to other people, you can sell it. But I don't necessarily know that it's something that we would do just for like the overall expense.
Well, and that makes sense. Like you said, it's something that can pay for itself over time. I think if you're really, committed to that technology and that process, but it's very much something that you have to consider and weigh in. How committed would you be, from my understanding?
Well, and even, I mean, with those two examples that I gave, right? Having a tighter calving window, that is absolutely going to bring you money in your herd. And if you have a very common problem of losing cattle to larkspur, that is obviously going to change that issue and bring in more money. So it's not to say that you can't find a way to make it make sense and like to physically make it pencil out. But I just don't necessarily know that aside from using it as post-fire grazing, I absolutely see the merits of it. And I highly encourage anybody who has considered virtual fence to use it because we have had such a great experience with it. But I don't necessarily know that we would do it to our entire herd.
So what else do you think ranchers need to be considering before they dive into virtual fencing? I mean, I know you're still new into it, but if you were to talk to a neighbor who said that they were maybe looking into it? What questions should they maybe ask themselves to make sure it's right for them?
I would say, are you able to make the time to truly onboard yourself? Because we as ranchers like, oh, I can figure that out. This isn't necessarily that way. You actually have to be very dedicated to sitting down with your customer success specialist and learning how the program works. You absolutely have to spend the 4 days training your animals. If you're not going to effectively train them, it is not going to work. And why would you ever invest in something if you're not going to go all in? If you're only going to half butt it. I can't say the other word. So half butt. If you're only going to do it with your half butt, right? You wouldn't do it. So I would say the same in this, especially because it is, I mean, like I said, you can absolutely make it pencil out, but if you are going to have to buy a base station or a number of base stations, that is a significant investment. And so if you're going to make that significant investment, then you absolutely have to then also make the investment of your time in learning how to use the technology and the time of your herd for that training purpose.
Okay, so with those stations, how many square miles or like what's the radius? Because you mentioned you would need to get a few of them if you were to completely adopt this. So like what range do they cover, if you know?
Yeah, so technically speaking, I don't know the actual radius, but that being said, it definitely depends on the topography of the area. So if it is able to be placed in a really high spot and everything else in that field is going to be of lower altitude, then it's going to have a much larger footprint, if you will. But if you are in an area that is pretty darn flat, and then maybe you've got some other draws or steep areas that kind of go off of that highest point, like thinking like you're going to put it on a flat mesa, and then it's not going to be able to see into the bottom of those draws or areas. And so then you're going to have a little bit less coverage in those areas. And it is important to have coverage. You can technically, though, program your collars ahead of using them. So you could program your collars, then send your cattle into an area where they're uncovered. And because the collar is pre-programmed, it's going to know what to do without being able to talk to the base station. You're just not going to have any real-time data as far as where your cows are, where they've been, any of the information that you can see using, in this case, Vince's herd manager. You're not going to be able to see that because your cow needs to be able to be in an area that has connection to the base station in order to then be seen in the software.
Okay. Well, and I had heard the topography thing before, but I just wasn't sure, how much advancement they had made with it. And I know every company's maybe a little bit different too on that front. So Jessie, I'd imagine you guys weren't the only ranchers impacted by this fire. Were there other neighbors or producers in the area who also decided to use this technology to shift their grazing, or were you guys kind of the only ones who kind of took that leap?
So we were the only producers who were impacted in these fires as far as, so one other producer was burned, but it burnt the entirety of the field in which he grazed in that area. So he obviously, there's no way to use vents. You can't virtually fence a cow off of something that's burned in its entirety. And then there's another field that we run in common with somebody, actually where the fire started, which is maybe like a quarter of a mile away from where the border of that allotment. So we'll actually be able to run our cattle in there this summer because it didn't burn a large enough chunk to where we have to stay off of that permit. So one producer that we run, or that we would run with, he is not affected just because of the limited size in acreage of how that fire impacted him. And then the other one isn't going to be able to come back for that 2 years.
It's always interesting for me to talk to producers who are running cows or grazing cows on public land because that's not something I ever grew up with, nor do we do today. So would you say you had a pretty good relationship with whoever you're working with, those BLM lands, to kind of get this going? Or was this something that really built that relationship stronger? I mean, what's that relationship like for you?
Yeah, I will say, because obviously I think that we've all heard things when it comes to the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service or whoever it may be, that working with them isn't necessarily the easiest. And I will say our field office is absolutely wonderful. We have the greatest range con ever. And she was the one who brought this to us and said, hey, I think you guys should try this. I think that it would be great for you. I think that you would also be really great because again, this field office has never used this technology before. So we are the first permittees that have used virtual fencing as a method for post-fire grazing. And so she was really excited about us using it to then kind of be a testament to other ranchers of, is this going to work for you in the future or is it not? And everybody in their field office has been so wonderful. And I am very, very thankful. And as you mentioned, it's absolutely made our relationship with them that much stronger. And I am so thankful that we do have such a great relationship with them because we've also had range cons in the past that were not necessarily easy to deal with in the slightest. So we've been on the other side of the spectrum. We love Katie and we hope that she never leaves or goes to other permittees because we want her only for ourselves. But I am so thankful that they were willing to offer this to us because it really has made a difference for us.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you have a good experience and a good relationship there. Jessie, before we wrap up today, is there anything else you'd like to share about this topic?
No, with the exception of if anybody does have specific questions as to how we've used it, please feel free to reach out. I know that it is definitely a financial investment and there is the investment of time and knowing, is my herd even going to be a good fit for it? So please, if you do have questions and you want somebody to chat with, you are more than welcome to contact me and I can kind of give you a little bit more about our experience with it.
Absolutely. And I will put Jessie's information in the show notes. And I would be remiss not to mention that if you are looking for an employee or want to find a job, you should definitely check out Up the West because Jessie has quite the business there for the Western and rural space. So with that, folks, remember to share this episode with a friend who might find it helpful. Subscribe, rate, review. That's the best way to help all podcasters, not just this show. But with that, happy ranching.